He stretched upright and craned his neck, trying to look past the couple seated between him and the window. But all he could see was a solid cloud layer thousands of feet below. He was still holding out hope that the skies would be clear and sunny at his destination. They always were in the travel brochures. He turned his attention back to the in-flight magazine, but found it was only good for about 10 minutes before he'd seen everything that even remotely interested him. Unfastening his seatbelt, he stood up and opened the overhead bin to retrieve an Athens city map out of his carry-on bag. Settling back into his seat, he unfolded and was studying the well-worn map when the drink cart made its way up the aisle. Since he was only a few rows behind the first-class section, he was quickly served a Coke and a coffee. If he couldn't sleep, he'd make full use of the caffeine. With his drinks and the map spread out on the folding table, he hunched over the map and began planning yet another walking tour. By the time he'd once more dug into his carry-on to retrieve a couple of travel guides to cross-reference with his map, the flight attendants were loading up the carts in the rear galley in preparation for the meal service. A passing shadow caused him to look up as an unpleasant-looking man in a rumpled suit came striding up the aisle ahead of the economy class meal cart and walked right into first class. He was quickly intercepted by a flight attendant. Though he couldn't make out all the words, it was obvious from the man's gestures that he wanted to use the first-class lavatory. The attendant was politely but firmly letting him know that it was for first-class passengers only. That was not an answer he was willing to accept. He was no longer asking, but rather demanding to use the lavatory. His voice had risen enough that Michael could now make out his words, which came out with a Russian-sounding accent. "Sir, please take your seat or use the toilet in the back of the plane," the flight attendant said, matching his volume and tone. The passenger was a good foot taller than she was, but she didn't let that intimidate her, standing her ground firmly. The man's voice continued to rise, and he could now be heard several rows back. "He's busy," he shouted, pointing angrily at the aft lavatory. "And food is in way," he added with another angry gesture towards the meal cart, as if somehow it was all her fault that it was blocking the aisle just when he needed to use the toilet. "Sir, this is for first-class passengers only," she repeated for at least the fourth time, regaining some of her composure and trying to calm him down. "If you'll just step into your seat, we can push the cart past you and let you by." But the man refused to be placated, his voice becoming angrier with each fresh outburst. Neither of them was willing to give in. There was a growing buzz among the passengers, and some appeared to be getting ready to step in to assist the flight attendant, when suddenly the man stopped talking. His attention was distracted by something in front of him. Michael's full attention had been on the argument, but now he followed the man's gaze past the petite flight attendant. Another attendant was just hanging up the phone on the bulkhead between the cabin and the cockpit. She must have been talking to the pilots, because she picked up 2 meal trays and stood expectantly by the door to the cockpit. A moment later, the door was opened from the inside. Suddenly, so quickly that it caught everyone off guard, the man grabbed the attendant by her shoulders and shoved his way past her. She let out a startled shriek and tried to fight back, shocked into action as the argument turned physical with no warning. Michael and a number of the other nearby passengers added their own cries of protest and began yelling at the man in a variety of languages. A few tried to jump to her assistance, only to find they were securely strapped into their seats. Before they could release their buckles, the man had spun her around and shoved her to the floor. She let out another loud cry, this time one of pain. Several passengers who'd managed to get out of their seats sprang to help her while the attackers sprinted toward the cockpit door. The struggle had now caught the attention of everyone on board, including the attendant about to serve the meals to the pilots. She was frozen in place, exactly what the man wanted. He lunged at her, grabbing her as she stood defenseless with a tray in each hand. Her cry of fear and alarm drowned out the drone of the engines and filled the cabin as he shoved her effortlessly aside, sending the food trays flying, and leapt through the door, pulling it shut before anyone could react. Michael wondered if the pilots would be able to fend him off before remembering that at least one of them was strapped helplessly into his seat, just like most of the passengers were. And the hijacker, the word shocked him even as he thought it, had the element of surprise. They were expecting a meal only to be met by what? Was the man armed? He hadn't noticed a weapon, but maybe he had one concealed? These thoughts raced through his head almost faster than he could answer his own questions. Only seconds had passed, but he'd already come to one conclusion. This can't really be happening. Several of the first-class passengers had recovered enough that they were now helping the second attendant to her feet. She didn't appear as badly hurt as the first one had been, and once they were sure she had no serious injuries, 2 male passengers helped her into the rear-facing seat she'd occupied during the takeoff. What had started out as shock and indignation on the part of the passengers quickly turned into a fear that filled the cabin. Every one of them began thinking about that same September morning that had changed the world. The whole plane was engulfed in an uneasy silence. What had happened took a while to sink in for the attendant who'd been about to enter the cockpit. When it did, she sprang to her feet and grabbed the door handle, only to find it securely locked. She pulled at it frantically, then grabbed for the phone hanging beside the door. There was no answer from the other side, but she kept trying. Watching her trying to do something served as a cue for everyone else. They all began talking at once. Many started sobbing. Parents rushed to comfort children. Husbands hugged their wives, and people traveling alone looked around helplessly, desperately seeking someone to talk to. In the midst of all the confusion, the cabin crew's training took over. They began attempting to restore order and get everyone seated and quieted down, with no success at all. Everyone who had a cell phone pulled it out and turned on the send and receive function, despite what the air regulations demanded. Frantic calls were attempted to family and friends all over the globe. Without exception, everyone was wishing they'd booked the trip on a different airline. It seemed wrong somehow that the aircraft was continuing to fly on and on as if nothing had happened. The engines droned steadily. It was flying straight and level. There was no change whatsoever in altitude or heading. Around the cabin, small groups of passengers began forming. Michael joined the nearest discussion because, just like everyone else, he had the overpowering need to talk to someone. The need to do something was also overwhelming, but there was nothing to do but talk. The talk at first was speculative. "He's a terrorist. He's going to fly us into something," raved one man with a German accent. His voice sounded abnormally high, with fear and panic becoming stronger with each word. "Nope," replied a man with an accent from somewhere in the American South. "He's a Russian, a commie, not an Arab." He pronounced the word Arab with a long A. His slow drawl was having a calming effect on some of the other nearby passengers. "I'll bet when he gets a suitcase full of good old American currency, he lets us all go." "I hope you're right," responded his seatmate dubiously. Just then, a man from another group of passengers walked over, and the discussion was no longer speculative. "We've been talking over there." He pointed back to a group of 4 other men who were looking at them with nervous but determined expressions on their faces. "We think we should try to take him out. Unless he knows how to fly one of these things, the pilots must still be alive. If we can break down that door, we've got enough guys to overpower him. Plus, we can get some knives from the stewardesses. They've got a ton of them on those trays." Most airlines had returned to the practice of entrusting their passengers with real cutlery rather than the plastic kind. They weren't sharp, but they'd do in an emergency, and this was definitely an emergency as far as the passengers were concerned. "I don't know," said Michael, speaking for the first time. "That's been tried a couple of times before, and neither of those ended well." He was thinking of footage she'd seen of a hijacked airliner crashing into the ocean off the coast of Africa. The pilot and a hijacker had been fighting for control of the plane as it attempted a forced landing along the shoreline. And everybody aboard knew what had happened in Pennsylvania. It had been the subject of numerous books and movies. Those passengers had been heroes, no doubt about that, but they had known what their fate was, and the risk had been worth it. No one on this flight knew what was happening, yet. "He's right," another voice with an accent unfamiliar to Michael agreed. "Besides, those doors are locked and reinforced with Kevlar or something. We'd never be able to break in there." Michael nodded in agreement. "The only reason that guy got in there was someone opened the door from the inside. So we're just going to sit here and do nothing, just wait here at the mercy of some terrorist and let him kill us all without a fight?" The passengers were quickly dividing into 2 opposing groups. "And what if you end up getting us all killed trying to play hero with some negotiator on the ground who's already settling everything?" The new voice came from yet another passenger who up to this point had been sitting and listening to the conversation. "You might come out a hero if it works, but if it doesn't, well, at least you'll still make the news." A loud, confused babble broke out, with arguments for and against taking action. Everyone was speaking at once until one voice rose over all the others. "What are we all waiting for?" he shouted angrily. "If we end up diving into the Vatican or the Med, it'll be too late to figure out a better plan. Anything's better than giving up without a fight." Without warning, the plane banked suddenly to the left. Everyone froze, and all conversation stopped. All eyes were fixed on the door to the cockpit, as if somehow, by looking at it hard enough, they could figure out what was happening up there. Then a soft chime announced that the PA system had been activated, and the silence became even deeper as they waited for the coming announcement. The captain began speaking, using the low growl that all airline pilots used in making announcements to their passengers. That voice had to be the prerequisite for the left front seat of an airplane, Michael had often thought. The voice was carefully cultivated to instill confidence and trust in the minds of the passengers, always sounding in control, as if the speaker were bored by the simple act of flying an airliner 7 miles above the ground at 500 miles an hour. Despite the terror lurking in everyone's heart, this captain's voice was no exception. Hearing something, anything from up front, quickly calmed the atmosphere in the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I know you're all aware of there was a short pause as he searched for the right words, the incident that just occurred. I want to let you know that everything is fine up here on the flight deck. We've been asked to make a slight change in the route of our flight this morning. I've advised air traffic control, and we've been assigned a routing to our new destination. Michael thought back to all those documentaries he'd watched on Discovery Channel, where the pilot figured that an onboard fire meant they had a slight problem on board. He also noted that there was no mention of what the new destination was. I've been asked to assure you that no harm will come to the aircraft or to any of the crew or passengers, and to advise you not to try anything, as the man up here with us is not acting alone. There was a long pause, during which the passengers glanced around nervously, wondering if there really was a second hijacker among them. I'll provide you with more information when I'm able to do so. Please take your seats and follow the instructions of the cabin crew. The cabin remained quiet after the captain's announcement. The passengers looked around uncertainly, wanting to believe that what they'd heard was true, that they really were going to come out of this unharmed. The flight attendants took full advantage of the change in atmosphere and began directing everyone back to their seats, reminding them to keep their seatbelts fastened. The 5 men who'd been ready to storm the flight deck still looked like they wanted to do something, but the reassuring voice of the captain and his instructions seemed to have taken most of the wind from their sails. Supposedly, he was still in some kind of control, so they too returned to their seats. "Where do you think we're going?" asked the man beside Michael. He looked at the man and his wife and shrugged his shoulders. They were headed east, he figured, or close to it. He tried to remember the geography of Europe. How far south had they flown already? Where were they headed? Hungary? Serbia? He searched for the in-flight magazine. There was always a map in the back, wasn't there? His trembling fingers desperately flipped through the pages of the magazine for the maps, but he couldn't find them. Desperate for an answer, he looked around for someone close by who might help. Across the aisle from him sat a man that looked very out of place somehow. He'd been the late arrival, the last one to board the flight. There was no surprise or uncertainty in his expression. He seemed to be the only calm person on the whole flight. Michael had been too engrossed in what was happening and concentrating too hard on the discussions around him to notice something unusual about the man. He was the only one who'd remained both seated and silent throughout the entire ordeal. "What country's east of us?" he asked, thinking that somehow the man looked vaguely European and that he must know the geography of this part of the world. The man turned slowly to face Michael, his expression calm but his face ashen. He looked Michael square in the eye and said one word in a thick accent, the same accent the hijacker had spoken with: "Ukraine." He turned to face straight ahead again and repeated the word, but this time his voice was tinged with fear, or was it with resignation? It came out as a mere breath: "Ukraine." The tone of his voice sent a fresh chill through Michael's heart. It wasn't resignation or fear he was hearing, and the look on his face wasn't calm, Michael now realized. There was no expression on it at all. The tone of his voice was beyond resignation. It was total despair, perfectly matching what he saw in the man's eyes. It was hard to look at that face, yet he couldn't look away either. He was looking at a dead man, someone who had no expectation of surviving. This man knew something about what was happening and had given up all hope. That frightened Michael more than anything else that had yet happened. Were they going to share the same fate?